Okay, welcome to Inside the Studio. I am Camila,
I'm Brendan Lyons.
and today we have Joshua Feriante. Joshua, we would love to get to know you a little bit more. Your credentials, of course. I know I'm missing a few, MD or DO, I believe.
Yep, that's right.
Please clarify and let us know. Yeah.
Yeah, sure thing. So I was just telling you both earlier that this is my first podcast, so I'm really excited to be a part of this. I think it's really great. I don't do anything in design at all. Like Camila and Brendan were saying, I'm a doctor. I am out of the U.S. Now, typically, doctors in the U.S. they have MD after their um, names to signify that they have a doctorate in medicine. However, I'm a little different. I have a graduate degree in Doctor of Osteopathy, which is essentially regular physician training, but I get additional training in osteopathic principles. And the easiest way to think about that, it's like chiropractics plus. So lots of body manipulation, soft tissue, like muscle movements, trying to look at the person in a more holistic sense. And so that's what the designation DO means. So as far as the U.S. is concerned, MDs, DOs are practically the same. And so sometimes people have questions about that. I am a real doctor.
So
We know for sure.
also the other thing too, you did MBA as well, right? You were doing an
Yeah,
MBA concurrently. Is that correct?
yeah, absolutely. So the medical school that I went to offered a master's in business administration program in addition to a, a doctor's degree. And so I decided, I'm interested in business. I was thinking about going into industrial organizational psychology before I decided on medical school. So for me, it just kind of made sense. And the way that the program worked out, I earned my MBA for basically a song. It was only maybe like $15,000 compared to, you look at some of these big MBA programs like, Wharton or Kellogg's or, take your pick. It's easily 60, 80, even like $120,000 to earn an MBA. So for me, it seemed like a pretty easy choice. Even if I
That's
get
so
going
Amazing.
into
interesting.
business, you can't take the knowledge from me. It's stuck up in here, so it's
No,
only going to benefit me and hopefully patients down the road.
100%.
Absolutely. And also, we really appreciate you being here because we would like to talk about how did you get into this, field of forensic childhood psychology, and what did fuel your passion for this realm?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really long, windy road. So I'll try to keep it short. When I applied to medical school, I fully intended on being a cancer doctor and oncologist, and that's what I spent my first 3 years focusing in on. Now, I had already gotten a bachelor's degree in in psychology, which is therapy, like cognition, perception, social psychology, all sorts of things. And so I was interested in psychology even from years back, but I had no inclination of going into mental health as a doctor. It wasn't until the very end of the third year of medical school, and just as a quick primer, the first 2 years of medical school is what we call didactic. So it's all the book learning, it's all the testing, it gets you ready to take your boards. And then the last 2 years of medical school are really designed to be more hands-on experience. So you do different rotations, they're usually a month long. Different programs have different ways of doing it, but you get experience in emergency medicine, pediatrics, family medicine, mental health. And that happened to be one of the last rotations I had in transitioning from third to fourth year. And again, to keep a long story short, I realized during that rotation that I really like mental health. And I think the reason why I thought oncology would be a good fit for me was because when you give someone a diagnosis of cancer, um, it's not just that person who has to deal with it. There's a whole family structure around them. When I was doing my oncology rotation, I was working with an oncologist, a really great guy, Dr. Lee, and his office was just so busy. it was just appointment after appointment, just lots of people coming in looking for help. And what I noticed is that it was actually very rare to have a single person show up. It was almost always a family, whether it was like a couple or the children. It was usually older adults, right? Like grandparents. And so like their kids would be their grandkids to support them. And that just really made an impact on me. And like I mentioned, it was rare to see someone just show up by themselves for something as monumental as that. And so when I did this mental health rotation, I realized that the part of oncology that really called out to me was the fact that you can walk with people through some really difficult stuff. And if I went into mental health, I could do that all the time. I didn't have to wait for a cancer to show up or something. And so I immediately scrapped all my plans. Like my parents, because I've been telling them for years, I was like, hey, I'm going to be a cancer doctor. They're like, woo, he's going to be a real doctor. And then I told them, hey, I'm going to psychiatry. And they're like, is that still doctoring? Like, so
It is.
it is, yeah. And so, oftentimes people, they'll get confused between psychiatry and psychology. They're very similar words, but very different fields. So the typical thing that people think of when it comes to mental health is a psychologist. These are usually people that have like a PhD or even a PsyD, which is more of like it's maybe a little less research-based, more clinically based. And that takes years and years of training. And they're kind of top of their field as far as offering talk therapies, doing cognitive testing, learning disability testing, neuropsychological testing. They're really important, and they do a lot of really great work. And then psychiatry, on the other hand, we're medically trained. We go through 4 years of medical school, and we do what's called a postgraduate education year, where it's 4 or more years of training on the job in a hospital or a clinical setting, where we actually learn the art of medicine, because we did all the book learning, we watched how things worked, and then we finally get to see the rubber hit the road, and we figure out how do we use medications and therapies together in order to help people, usually with severe mental illness like depression, anxiety, psychosis, OCD. There's just a wide variety of different mental illnesses that people have to deal with. And so for me, I focus more on doing a good diagnostic evaluation, just like a psychologist would, but I deal primarily with medications, where I provide, whether it's antidepressants or mood stabilizers. I've even given shock therapy to people. Some people really have a bad impression of that. It's actually one of the most effective treatments that we have for severe depression and psychosis, mania, all sorts of things. And I can just get into the weeds about all this, but needless to say, I really like the idea of being a psychiatrist because I would have access to a full toolkit. And that's been my experience. Now, the forensics part, I just kind of happened into that, where I was working at a state hospital in Massachusetts for residency, and one of the rotations I did was in a forensic setting, where, and to provide some clarification on this, forensic psychiatry, it's not talking with dead people. It's not like having seances or, people are like, what is forensic psychiatry? The easiest way to think about it, it's the cross section between mental health and the law.
Right.
Plain and simple, right? And so a forensic psychiatrist doesn't have like super mind powers or does seances or anything. What we do is we try to answer questions that lawyers, judges, juries, states, governments, we try to answer questions that people need to know in order for the law to function.
Right.
And so it turns out there's a huge overlap between mental health, mental illness, and the law. So for instance, a lot of people don't know this, in most states across the United States, I'm not aware of how it works in Canada, but psychiatrists are kind of the last line in determining whether or not we can hospitalize someone against their will if they have mental illness. That's a big deal. You're able to, obviously with justification, deprive someone of their liberties if they're either putting themselves at a risk, they're putting other people at risk, or they're just not able to take care of themselves. Like they literally can't find shelter, they can't feed themselves. They're at risk of dying or serious injury because of their mental illness. And so, again, I think that highlights just how much of an intersection there is between the law and mental health.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
Big.
You had, in a way, you said you stumbled on the forensic side, right? In Massachusetts. So you went into childhood forensic. So how did that come about?
Oh gosh. So again, I'm going to try to keep this one short. So it took me maybe a year or two in my residency training. So like I mentioned, it's 4 years of adult training after medical school in order to be a practicing psychiatrist in the United States. And it was within the first year or two, I really started seriously thinking, do I want to go on and get additional training in what's called a fellowship? And that's where you get subspecialty training in something. And so I was really interested in child and adolescent psychiatry because, kind of going back to that experience I had in the oncology clinic, most people are just not alone. There's usually a family structure associated with them. And what I found is that by the time they made it to clinic, people with severe mental illness, whether psychosis or depression, a lot of the family and social supports and structures that most people tend to enjoy, those had withered away for these adults. And what we know from the literature is that if you get good social supports, if you have family around, if you have people that love and care for you and are willing to support you through difficult times, you tend to do a lot better. And unfortunately, there's lots of people, especially adults out there, that just don't have that structure. And so I wanted to try to intervene earlier in someone's life as a child or as a teenager to see what I could do to help stem some of that severe mental illness that can happen if people don't get the right treatment. And plus, kids are fun. Kids, they're,
Yeah.
a lot of people say they're very resilient. In a sense, that's true. A lot of kids, though, they go through some really tough stuff. And if only their parents or their caregivers had the right information, had the right supports, had access to helpful things, things would tend to go a lot better for these kids. And so that was kind of a big draw for me to go into child and adolescent psychiatry. And it was actually, I had to decide, do I want to do child or adolescent, or do I want to do forensics? Because if I did all of them together sequentially, that would be 7 years of training after medical school. That's a long
Wow.
time. That's the same amount of training that a neurosurgeon gets, just to give
Wow.
you an idea. There's not a
Yeah.
lot of people that do child and forensic work. There's maybe a few hundred in the United States. Nobody actually knows, but it's not a big number. And so it turns out that most people are not masochists. They don't like going through years and years of training. They just want to get into practice. They just want to start helping people. And ultimately, so I did my child training, and I don't ever do anything without discussing it with my wife first as far as like career or what I'm going to do for training. And I told her, I was like, listen, I still have enough left in me. I really want to do forensics. I think I'd regret it if I didn't get that additional training.
Right.
And so that's how I ended up doing a forensics fellowship after my child training. And so far it's been a really good experience.
Yeah, and I just want to tell all the listeners and viewers, like, this is very special for us to meet with you, Josh, because, like you said, you're one of the few, and we really appreciate that in your time.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Maybe before we get into some of the meat that we're wanting to discuss today, what's the day in the life of a person like yourself who's doing childhood forensic psychiatry?
Oh gosh, it varies a lot. I would say that generally, because I'm still in training, my day's pretty regimented. So for instance, Mondays I have a full clinic day in the local county jail. And I actually go into the jail. They don't allow me to carry cell phones. I have to use, their provided laptops, and there's correction officers everywhere, and everything's locked down. And I go in and I see people who are suffering from mental illness, and I work with them to figure out, how do we handle your depression? How do we handle psychosis? Do you need to go to an inpatient unit if you're not safe? And so I do that once a week. I attend lots of didactics. I get about 8 hours of didactic learning modules, lectures, seminars on a weekly basis. And the rest of my time, I do forensic evaluation. So I go to a state hospital. So the closest state hospital where I am in Sacramento right now is Napa State Hospital. Most people don't know this. There is a giant mental health hospital in Napa that's been around for over 100 years, and it's got like over 1,000 patients who are involved in the legal system.
Wow.
And receiving care. And it's not, it's obviously not on the list of tourist sites to go to, but it's out there if you like want to go drive by it. And so I go down there and I do evaluations. I do a number. So for instance, I've done competency evaluations. Turns out here in the United States, I didn't know this until I actually got into the program, it's practically unconstitutional to try someone in court if they're not with it enough to participate in their own defense. I didn't know that. I thought that's really interesting. And it's undermining of liberty to try somebody and to sentence them if they don't have an understanding of what's going on. So, you can think of someone who's psychotic, schizophrenic, and they think they're on Neptune, and they have no understanding of what they're doing in a court. Those people, they actually need treatment, so that's what those state hospitals are for generally. And the goal is to treat them so they can come back and eventually, be present here on Earth, understand what the reality is, and participate in helping their lawyers mount a good defense. Mm-hmm. And so I've done those kinds of evaluations. I've done safety evaluations for people who are physically or sexually violent. Eventually, they get treated, and then the big question becomes, do we keep them here in the hospital forever, or do we let them back out into the community? Well, somebody's got to figure that out. What are the actual risks? What does research show? What are the tools that we can use to minimize the risk of something bad happening? So I've done those evaluations too. And right now I'm involved in a case. Again, I'm not aware of how the Canadian law works, but here in the United States, most states have what's called a not guilty by reason of insanity defense, where if someone's like acutely psychotic or they've got a mental illness and they're unable to understand the nature or the quality of what they've done, that's a crime. It's a defense where instead of going to prison, they go to a hospital and receive treatment because they're so ill they had no understanding of what they did.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely fair. And it's interesting, like you said, you outlined before, these types of people, they have a lot of baggage, right, from the past. Like they don't get to those places just by magic. And so what are some of the fundamental psychological elements that define like a thriving environment for children so that there can be mitigation to that process where they get to that point?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you take the word thriving, it doesn't mean being happy. But the thing that comes to mind for me with thriving is that you're succeeding and that you're continually progressing, that you're continuing to develop as a person. And not just individually, but develop within a family structure, your community, the society at large. And so that term thriving, I think, is more than just, meeting the status quo. So within the terms of like childhood development, to thrive as a child is to move from one stage of development to the next. And without getting into too much detail, you can think of, you're an infant. What's one of the first things that you have to learn as an infant? Can I trust my parents to take care of me?
Right.
Right? And then can I connect to them? Am I attached to my caregivers where if I cry, they come running, right? If I need something, they're going to take care of it for me. And eventually that lends itself to a next stage of development, which is gaining mastery of your environment. The reason why toddlers toddle and they're into everything all the time is because they're trying to figure out, how does the world work? And they need that experience in order to, again, master their environment. And then as they continue to get older, you can think of school age children. Well, what are they doing? They're learning how to work. They're learning to be industrious. If I do a good job here, I'll get a good grade. If I follow the rules, good things happen, right? And then that eventually leads itself to becoming a teenager, which is a roller coaster for a lot of people. Where do I fit in society? What's my meaning? What's my purpose? How do I navigate becoming an adult? And this whole idea of development doesn't just stop once you become a young adult. It keeps going. There's a reason why midlife crises happen, is because I guess the simplest definition of it is you get to that point in the middle of your life where you realize, man, this is about as far as I go. And for some people, they're really happy with it. Other people, it turns into a midlife crisis. and that's kind of the stereotypical reason why midlife crises happen, is because I'm only ever going to be X, Y, Z. I've done as much as I can. This is my apex. This is as far as I go. And I'm not happy with it. And I'm going to change things. And sometimes it's great, and sometimes they go off the edge of the cliff. And so even in old age, you're still developing. The last kind of, lack of a better term, last stage of a person's life, if they're lucky enough to make it old age, is, did I do everything I needed to do?
Right.
Or am I going to regret my life? And that's still considered a part of a person's development. And so thriving is hitting each of those developmental stages, because it is really possible to get stuck.
Yeah.
I've met plenty of people. I've done a decent amount of trauma work where early in life they learn, I can't trust anybody. Relationships that are supposed to be loving and caring and nurturing are actually harmful. And getting close to people puts me in danger. And that's, if that happens early on in life, that makes for a pretty shaky foundation, where it makes it really difficult to continue to develop and to continue to thrive as a person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I think with all that being said, like that's why we're here. Like you decided your fueling for that passion is, prevent that to happen, right? As much as we can. And I think that, as you know, we and the listeners know, we have a design business and we deal with spaces all the time, right? And we would like to know, like, how are these design factors influence the emotional and psychological health of children? Like, how can we design spaces? And I know can be very, we can go very in depth with this, but like just the main factors. How can we make a child feel safe environmentally in their home through synesthesia or through their life experiences?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'll be the first to say that my knowledge of interior design is really pretty minimal. So I'm coming at this mostly from kind of the psychological side of things. So to answer your question, what does it take to help kids develop or to be psychologically sound? And a lot of it, based off of my own clinical experience, some of the research that I've done, a lot of it has to do with relationships. And a really big idea in mental health is this idea of attachment. And the simplest definition of it is the relationship that occurs between a child and a caregiver. That caregiver is usually mom. Obviously, there are attachments that form with dad and grandparents, or foster parents, or any number of caregivers. But that type of attachment is really important, because it's what allows a child not only to feel safe, but also to risk things. And so, if you've ever seen a little toddler or a young child in a park, or if you've got nieces, nephews, when they're young, you'll notice, man, they really stay attached to mom. They don't really like wandering out a whole ton, but as they grow, they'll start to wander out. They'll leave, they'll play with things, maybe something scares them, they go running back to mom, right?
Right.
And the idea is that that caregiver is a safe base where if something goes wrong, if they get scared by something, they're not sure what's going on, they can always come back. But they're encouraged to go out and to explore their environment, to learn new things, to master their environment. The reason why I bring that up is because as I was going through trying to understand a little bit better this connection between design and mental health, uh, one of the themes that kept popping up over and over again is this idea of balancing dualities or two different ends of the spectrum, right? And that comes up over and over again. And the first one, like I mentioned, is that duality of safety and risk. If a child is in risk all the time, they're going to be in that fight or flight mode where they're not going to be in position to build relationships because they're going to be so worried about their own well-being. If things are too safe and cushy all the time, it's a recipe for languishing, for not developing. Because one of the, now Brendan, I know that you have a lot more experience with exercise and weightlifting than I do. And that's one of the principles is you only get stronger if you've got something to resist. And sometimes it's
Right.
uncomfortable. Sometimes things get a little hectic. But if you're doing it responsibly, what ends up happening is your muscles grow, you get stronger, your constitution becomes more resilient, and you don't tire as easily, you're more conditioned. The same thing happens with our emotional and psychological well-being. We do need some type of risk and resistance, and I guess for lack of a better term, problems in our lives to overcome.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's one really big part of promoting good health for children.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing you say is we need to design a space where they're set up for success. Like there's resilience in there; they have to be resilient. But you know, this like you had mentioned, like not putting people in a situation where they're overstretching.
This for me to translate, like, because being a designer myself, I'm a visual person, and so in a home I see, just for moms out there, have comfort that chaos comes with also organization, and so you have to have a little bit of both, from my understanding. And I know that there's also a way where moms can be very strict with their homes, or parents in general, that also creates an anxiety. So maybe we need to have a little that duality, like you said, and I appreciate that you bring that. Everything really, even emotionally, has to be balanced, and that's how parenting should work too. That's what I took from that.
Yeah, I'd be remiss to not talk something about, maybe some physical design where one thing is lighting. I mean, I know that we're kind of making a hard turn here. We're talking about psychological principles, but we're trying to thread that needle with doing design elements. And lighting is a really important thing for not just children, but for people. Being exposed to like blue light at nighttime throws off the circadian rhythm. So, and it also throws not just once you throw off the circadian rhythm, you got hormone imbalances. And so, like, raising kids, one of those things is technology. At a certain time, those things got to be turned off because these actually, they work on the physiological level, right?
I know, having done some research, because I'll be perfectly frank, most most professionals working within the mental health industry, we don't think about design.
Right.
We simply don't. You bring up light, Brendan. Light is really important. So in one of the articles I looked at, I think it was from 2006, they found that mental health patients who were hospitalized and put in rooms that faced the sun in the morning left the hospital earlier by 2 or 3 days in their
Wow.
hospitalization.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
And then there are even cases where they studied post-operative patients. So people had gone through surgery, they're waiting around after surgery. That's usually a pretty painful time. Lots of things like, use Tylenol and opioids and and all these analgesics to try to control the pain. And what they found is that simply by providing more natural light, whether that's through skylights or windows, a view of nature, and playing soothing music, they didn't have to use as many pain medications. So our physical environment, not only from a lighting perspective, but also being able to view or even interact with nature, they've got healing qualities to them that most of the time we're not taking advantage of. Part of the reason for that, I think, is because the primary goal in creating, say for instance, an inpatient psychiatric unit, it's not comfort, it's safety. When you're taking care of people who are suicidal or who are threatening to hurt themselves or other people, nice things kind of go out the window, and you're looking at, how do I possibly prevent bad things from happening
Right.
when we bring people in to try to help them. And so, providing a nature seclusion or a healing garden, it does not rise to the level of priorities, but maybe they should. Well, even when it comes down to art, there was an article, again, that I came across where it looked at some research about people's reactions to arts, like the kind of, the little art fixtures that you put on the wall. And what they found is that people who are experiencing severe mental illness, like psychosis or depression, they did not like abstract paintings. They had a negative reaction to it. And this probably comes as no shock or surprise, but the types of paintings that people liked, say for instance, so they actually did a little experiment on this where they said, okay, here's some abstract paintings where, you kind of have to be an art major to really kind of understand what we're getting at here. And we're going to have just nice, simple paintings. And then we're going to have paintings of natural environments. Mm-hmm. Of all the paintings that people enjoyed, it was the autumn painting of the fall. That was the one that most people liked. And I don't think that's by accident. And so, from the spectrum of, severely mentally ill people who can't stand abstract painting to, I find this autumn painting really comforting, I think that says something. Now, is it going to shorten hospital stays? Probably not. It would have to be a really good painting, I think. When it comes down to promoting a healing environment, even small little details like that, they seem to matter, at least from the research that I was looking at.
Absolutely. I think I like all of the things that are being said, because even though we take it as a secondary thing to think about, because you have to triage your day to day, right? So you're people with crisis every single day. However, we see that those small components of the physical world really affect us mentally, right? And my question to you too is, what do you think about today's institutions when it comes to schools for kids, hospitals? Do you think they're at that level of, thinking about these details, or are they not there yet?
Gosh, well, this is opening up a whole can of worms. So I guess I'll start with what I'm most familiar with, and that's the inpatient units. I've worked in some pretty high-end units where they do have like little healing gardens. They have private spaces where people can just go and be by themselves. But conversely, they also provide like a communal space where people can just hang out and talk together, or they'll participate in different group therapies. So having, again, that kind of idea of duality where you can be alone, but also you have the opportunity to interact with people in a positive way. You need both of those. And so, and some of these units are very nice, like very welcoming. They kind of have more of a home-like environment. And that's what some of the research shows, is that people tend to like environments that remind them of a home. And I've worked in some really pretty austere, Spartan places. So again, this is not something most people think about. A lot of jails and prisons have their own inpatient psychiatric units inside of the prison or the jail. The reason for that is because you're not going to be transporting dangerous criminals to the local hospital
Right.
to receive care. Nobody would necessarily think that's a great idea. Is it necessary to treat these people? Yeah, absolutely. Just because they're inmates or they've been convicted of things does not mean that they don't need care, right? And so you end up having that little inpatient unit in a lot of these jails and prisons. They're not great.
Yeah.
Imagine a jail cell, and it's pretty much that. It's all concrete cement. There's nothing soft inside of the area. And so I was getting a tour through one as part of my fellowship here, and I could not understand about every other word because of how bad the reverberations and the echo was,
Oh, wow.
just even within like the common room. And so I couldn't imagine having more than like 3 people in the space because it would all be muddled. It would just become like this auditory mess. And all of the furniture, there's nothing soft to it. It's all bolted to the floor because the last thing you want is somebody picking up a chair and taking somebody out with it.
Right.
And so, again, the primary goal of these units is safety, especially in a carceral setting in the prison. Could it be different? Probably could be. But I think if somebody had a solution for it, we would have kind of worked it out.
Yeah.
And so those are two very different ends of the spectrum that I've seen within an inpatient setting. And you can probably guess which one's more therapeutic. It's the one where it reminds you of home. It's got nice smells. You can walk up to the nurse and ask for Tylenol, or hey, when's the group therapy session happening? And I think we're going to hang out in the garden here and take some time to think to myself.
Yeah.
The other big thing is that a lot of inpatient hospitals, they're pretty limited in how many people they can take. And so in order to expand services, they'll actually start putting 2 or more people in a room.
Yeah.
And you can imagine that not a whole ton of people prefer that, especially if you don't have no idea who the person is next to you. Are they depressed or are they psychotic? Who knows? I'm going to find out, right? So, and a lot of people don't like that. Now, obviously, it has to be weighed. It's like, well, we only take 12 people if we do single rooms, but we could take 24 if we doubled. And that's a big difference for some places.
Yeah.
And so, again, a lot of it has to come down to weighing the pros and the cons for how you design places. There's not a single place that I've been to where there isn't something that's really good about it, but also something where, like, man, I wish that was different.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of been my experience in the inpatient setting. When it comes to schools, a lot of schools have really not changed in about a century. It's still that
Absolutely.
kind of, that European factory style, you will sit and you will listen. And that's not to say it's necessarily bad education. Some kids do really well in that setting. A lot of kids don't. And so from the research that I found so far, it turns out there's not a whole ton. So for instance, there's a literature review that I came across. I think it was literally published maybe a year or two ago. And they looked at 44 studies of studies concerning the design environment and children and mental health outcomes. You can imagine, with all the millions of kids out there and tens of thousands of schools, in fact, there's only 44 looking at this intersection. It's not very much data to work off of.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they did find is that, again, having kind of a home-like environment is pretty helpful. Learning isn't a contact sport. It doesn't happen when like your heart is pumping, your adrenaline's going. Learning happens in calm, when you're able to use all of your cognitive processes to receive, interpret, and store information. And one of the things that we know about kind of a fight or flight response, let's say you get freaked out by a bear, or you see your bully, or you're having to interact with one teacher that kind of hates your guts, is the more that your nervous system gets put online, the more that your heart pumps, the ability to think rationally actually goes right out the window. And it doesn't take much for that to happen. And I think one way that people see that is when you're watching game shows. Most people are really great at the game when they're sitting on the couch munching on popcorn and saying, "Oh, that's so easy. I know what the capital of Istanbul is, or whatever." But when you're in front of 500 people, all the lights are on you, they're asking you questions, how could you not freeze up?
Yeah.
It's a totally different environment. The fact that you can get the answer sitting on your couch while they're stumbling, that says a lot for just how much of that kind of rational center of your brain goes out the window as soon as your nervous system starts going into that fight or flight response. So whatever can be done at schools to help calm things down, that provides a more optimal environment for that kind of academic achievement. And so the other big thing too is providing spaces for kids to learn in different ways. Everyone's different. Some people, they take on a much more tactile, like touchy-feely, I need to feel this, I need to build this thing, I need to interact with this in order to understand it. I'm thinking engineers, right? Or, you get the kids that just love being physically active. Being stuck in a room for hours on end is like torture for a lot of those kids, especially boys. A lot of boys get misdiagnosed with ADHD because they just hate sitting in a seat all the time.
Right.
Now, girls tend to excel in that more calm, sitting down, staying still, and listening to a teacher sort of scenario. And so I think over the years, the school has tended to favor that because girls are more calm, they tend to be more mature than boys. Socially and emotionally, where they're just able to kind of handle themselves better. And I know that's speaking in stereotypical terms. It's a pretty general statement. Obviously, not everyone's the same.
Right.
But boys in particular do have a really tough time with the education system as it's presently constituted. And so providing different ways and means for that kind of interaction becomes really important. As far as, do you learn through listening to something? Do you learn through writing it? Do you learn through some kind of activity-based learning environment? The other thing too that I thought was interesting is that in this study, it pointed out that a lot of playgrounds are not structured to make it easy for kids to play, which kind of blows my mind. But say for instance you want to play a game of soccer, it's not happening if your field has a mound in the middle of it.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. Or if there's not enough space. The other thing I thought was really interesting, this is kind of a little offshoot where I started research a little bit more, the levels or the instances of injuries to young kids since, I want to say it's like 2019, actually it might be 1995 to 2019, has increased, even though playgrounds are becoming more safe. Why is that happening? One idea for it is that as playgrounds become more safe, for instance, when was the last time you saw a playground that had monkey bars on it? Right? They
Yeah.
don't really exist anymore. Well, because kids would fall off and break an arm or a leg, right?
Yeah.
Well, it might be that having those kind of more risky play structures actually provided an opportunity for kids to learn how to manage that risk, where they could figure out, oh, I'm too high, or I'm not strong enough, or maybe I'm running down this hill a little too fast. And sometimes it did result in injury. But a lot of times, kids learn their limits.
Right.
And you get rid of those opportunities, all of a sudden kids don't know their own limits. Or they're not given the opportunity to push their limits. And so when they finally do start doing something that could potentially be dangerous, it's a little too late.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, it's a common theme that we keep on touching on where, who have a well-developed child and ergo, as you get older, a well-adjusted person, you have to know your limits, but you also have to test those limits. Um, and I'm just wondering, there's a lot of people who have children, and it seems as though, with inflation, with all the things that are going on economically, um, there just seems to be almost less and less time for children when it comes to, for parents, because there's so much more demand that they have in their careers and providing for the basic needs of those children. What would you say to those parents who obviously want well-adjusted kids, want to help their mental health, but have a hard time carving out time for themselves to help those children become well-adjusted?
Oh gosh. I'll tell you what, if I had this all figured out, I would have like stadiums sold out of Las Vegas. Um, um, let me give you some insights that I've learned by looking at the literature, by doing clinical work, and also by listening to some really other smart people. And I'm also going to say this too, as a parent of young children, the struggle is real. Like to be able to find your own time, it it gets pretty difficult, and it's not a joke when certain you just have to decide the house is going to be a mess. That's just got to be what's got to be today. So let me start off by saying that parents don't have to be perfect. There's this idea in the mental health literature of what's called the good enough parent. And the idea behind that is you don't have to answer every call. You don't have to attend every need. You don't have to wipe away every tear. You just have to do it well enough, and your kid's going to turn out okay. In fact, the pursuit of perfection in providing and filling every need that a child has can actually become destructive. And what I mean by that is probably one decent example is the idea of helicopter parents. And I know that's like, kind of, I don't mean it by being derisive. The thing I want people to bring into their mind when they hear helicopter parent is the parent that does not allow their child to risk. And one evidence of this is the fact that there's a growing number of parents who will call schools or employers in order to advocate for their adult children. My child, Timmy did not get a good grade in his English, 102 class. I really need you to bump that up, professor. And it's a mom calling in for a grown adult, right? That's robbing that student of the ability to either just take the hit, learn what he needed to learn, and get better. And it's essentially atrophying that person's ability to meet the demands of life. And so that's an example of a destructive fulfillment of a person's. One of the big things that I have to not only remind other parents, but I have to remind myself is that your child deserves a parent who is well. And in order to be well, you have to do things that help you to be well. What does that look like? Are you sleeping enough? The average is 7 to 8 hours. A lot of people are not getting that. And I'm not talking like, decent sleep, like good sleep where you don't wake in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, or, having a child crawl into the bed and like kick you in the face. That might have happened to me last night. It's got to be like good sleep, okay? So again, and it goes back to that, what you mentioned, Brendan, about light. Light regulates the circadian rhythm, and circadian rhythm, what it comes down to is the energy boosts or lags that you get during the day in response to night or to daylight. When it's light, the brain soaks in all that light and says, all right, we're up, we're going, like this is the time to shine. And then as it starts to grow dark, that's your brain signal, okay, I need to start winding down, right? And if that cycle does get disrupted because we've got like little blue lights in our faces all the time, or we never turn off a TV, or we enjoy watching YouTube before we go to bed, or any number of things, that's essentially priming the brain to stay up longer and longer and longer. And it turns out one of the best treatments for getting good sleep, if you have insomnia, it's not medication, it's not melatonin, it's therapy. And the therapy, it's designed to say, listen, you're doing a bunch of things that are making it really hard for you to sleep. Let's start making some changes. And some people have a terrible attitude about sleep. Sleep's the worst. If I could never sleep, I would totally, go off and do X, Y, and Z. I've met people who have similar issues around food. If I could just have like a little pill that had all my nutrients and vitamins, I'd take that. I hate eating. Eating's the worst. There are just some people who don't like sleeping. And that therapeutic intervention is designed to get people to sleep better. So anyway, I'm harping on sleep. The other one, good diet. There's been a big push in the United States recently, the fact that everything is ultra processed. I think it's like 60% of calories eaten in the United States comes from ultra processed foods, which is,
Yikes.
these are things that you would never see growing out of the dirt or roaming around in nature. These are things where we have chemicalized them, filled them with all sorts of preservatives and other things, and we have very little idea of what it's actually doing to us. And especially in combination with a bunch of other processed, goods that we put into food. And so the closer you can get to nature, the better off you're going to be. And there's been lots of studies that show that cutting back on processed foods can help resolve depression. There have also been studies that show that eating processed food puts you in depression. And so it's not for everybody, but if somebody's predisposed to having a mood or anxiety disorder, it's like putting fire to kindling by eating junk. And part of that too is if you don't feel good, it's hard to feel good. And I know that's kind of being reductive, but that's basically what it comes down to. Other things is physical activity. I'll kind of bring in design elements a little bit. Living in San Diego is like one of the most expensive places, not only in California, but in the United States. And the most that we could afford while I was going through fellowship was a 2-bedroom apartment. It wasn't like a fancy bougie neighborhood or anything, but it was way too much money. And we lived there because we just couldn't afford anything else. And all like the little space that we had was like the little patio is maybe like 7 by 10 feet, not enough for little kids to run in. And the playground was the complete opposite end of the complex. And so trying to get 2 small kids out the door and just to the park, it was painful. It was really bad. And you had to pass through a parking lot to get there. I mean, talk about dangerous situations. Because I'll tell you what, there's a big difference when we moved to Sacramento. Obviously, Sacramento's still an expensive place, but the price difference was enough where we can go from a 2-bedroom apartment to like a 1,200 square foot 3-bedroom house with a backyard. And that's huge. One of the first things my kids did when we made it into the home and we were starting to set things up, they ran around the table in laps. We couldn't do that in the last place, right? So even just having space, it promotes physical activity.
Right.
And again, the reason why I'm harping on physical activity is because it's one of the universally accepted natural interventions that you can have for all sorts of things. It works in depression, it works in anxiety, it works for trauma, it works for all sorts of things. It's not a cure-all, but it really helps. Like there was one study I came across a while ago where 40 minutes of exercise 4 days a week for 4 months was about as good, if not better, than antidepressants for depression. That's really
That's
good.
amazing.
Yeah. And how many people are doing it? Not that many in the United States. So again, I'm not speaking Canada, but even in Canada, like where you're both at, like good luck taking a 40-minute walk in the middle of a winter vortex. Like there's some real challenges with that, and you might have to get creative. Whether that's weightlifting at home or just doing simple, plyometric exercises, even something as simple as walking. It doesn't have to be anything insane. It's literally, what am I doing to get my heart rate up today? And you don't necessarily have to break a sweat. You do have to get out and do something. Like going for walks, that's a triple threat there because you're getting exercise, you're out in nature, which we know does have healing properties to it. Just being out in nature helps diminish feelings of anxiety, depression. It increases the ability to handle pain, all sorts of things. And then you're also getting sunlight.
Right.
Walking's great. Oh, well,
Yeah.
that's assuming you're doing it during the day and not at night.
Right.
Fair enough. And
So those are some I guess like core principles where design can have a really big impact on that. Like I mentioned earlier, space, having an open space in your home, or even just a backyard, or not having your house filled with too much stuff. That can be really important. Now, conversely, just like in the inpatient units where you got some private spaces, you have communal spaces, having a private space in a house is pretty important too. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that, if you've got 6 kids, everyone gets a room. No, I don't think people could afford that.
Right.
But what it does mean is there some place that you as a parent or as a child, is there some place you can go where you can just be by yourself?
right.
And whether that's like a little reading nook or a space in the backyard, or you can get creative with it. And it's my place where I can go and just chill. And having that sort of space does become really important. So I feel like I've talked a lot. Tell me,
No, we love it. It's totally fine. I think we were discussing, that being a good parent is also looking after yourself as much as you can, because I know that your priority are your kids, right? But I think it also involves how you interact with your home, how you make your home that safe place for your kids and for yourself even, and interact with the outer world, doing all these physical activities and to be able to prevent mental health issues as much as you can, right? And I think all these points are so interesting. And just to, I don't know, Brendan, do you want to say any other? Do you have any other questions? Because I just had my last question, but before that, I'll let Brendan talk.
Well, I just think, something that's, there's a thought that sparks in my head about the Greek god of medicine. He had 2 daughters, and one was responsible for cure, one was responsible for prevention. And it sounds like there's a lot of physical things that we can do to not only prevent, but also cure some ailments when it comes to our mental health, right? As you've outlined. I think one thing that begs the question is at what point, because, there's, when preventative measures fail, at what point does someone know to delineate, okay, well, I need help with some medication? Especially for parents too, right? Because I think there's a big stigma with medication for children specifically, at least from where I come from. And so when do you know that that is the right method for cure?
yeah, well, you're bringing up a really important question because it's a question that comes up, I think, more often than any other as I'm working with children and their parents. So the idea of mental illness, there's all sorts of different ways that you could break it down. The hard thing about mental illness is that most of the time there's no objective sign for depression other than you look depressed, maybe you're acting a little, slowly where you're not getting up as quick. The rest of it is simply a person's subjective experience. Same thing with mania, same thing with psychosis. The objective signs, like you can't get like a blood test or a biomarker that says, yep, you've got it. It's all based off of a careful interview of a person. The way that mental illness is described now basically follows 2 principles. Are they experiencing distress because of their subjective experience in the world? Or is it impairing their ability to function, whether that's in school, at home, at work, in social relationships, family relationships? If there's distress, that means they're aware of what's going on. If they're impaired, a lot of people also are distressed, but a lot of people have no idea what they're experiencing. One in particular I'm thinking is psychosis. A lot of people have no idea that they're in the middle of a psychotic episode when they are. And so if someone's telling you, hey, listen, I'm really kind of freaked out by how bad I'm feeling or with what my experiences are, that's probably a good time to start looking at maybe getting some help. There are lots of things where maybe you're in the thick of things. You get bad news, bad things happen, someone passes away, gets ill, you get bad grades, you get kicked out of school. Like all sorts of things happen. It doesn't mean you're mentally ill. It's that ability to bounce back that has to go away in order for mental illness to start kind of becoming a possibility. And so in children, it becomes really difficult. Part of the reason why people are reluctant to use medications is because the research out there for a lot of medications is not as strong as what you get for adults. And there's good reason for that. It's because children are technically considered a protective research class or a protective population because we have to be more careful with kids than your average adult. They're susceptible to influence. They can be easily persuaded or pressured into things. They're also in a more vulnerable time developmentally, where the brain is still growing. It's still going through changes, whereas, you get to an adult above, age of 25, 30, the brain's pretty well set. At that point, you're just on a downhill incline, right? But up until that point, like, if you start messing around with medications or different things, the chances of things going wrong are higher than in an adult. And so that's why research doesn't happen as often in children as with adults. So there's plenty of good reason to try to put off medications. But there are also instances, lots of times, where medication does become the treatment of the hour. And it's usually after you've tried to address things at home, you've addressed things with a therapist, you've tried addressing it, and it's just not working out. And at that point, medications are really pretty helpful. Even before that, combining medications and therapies for a lot of different illnesses like depression and anxiety, they can be really helpful. It gets them back on track faster than just either one alone. And so ultimately what it comes down to is you've got to talk about it with your doctor. If you get a doctor that is push for medications, it might be because your kid's really ill. But if you get the sense like, oh, this person, they just want to give them meds and just let us go, it's okay to seek out another doctor to do that. Okay, if someone's not taking your concerns about medication seriously, that's the last thing that you want to do is just start something that you don't feel comfortable with. You really want someone to walk through with you and explain to you, here's the risks, here's the benefits, here's what happens if we use other medications, and here's what happens if we don't do anything.
Right.
And people want to be armed with that information, especially when it involves a child.
Yeah, I like that answer a lot. I think especially the getting a second opinion because, I'm not exactly sure how it works in Canada, which is ironic because I'm the one living in Canada. But I do know that there are mechanisms in place in America where doctors can get a rebate on the prescriptions that they give out. It's an interesting circumstance for choosing medication for another person, right? Like if you're choosing medication for a child, you're choosing that for them. So it's an interesting circumstance that you're in where you're effectively bypassing their rights in a way. Like I don't even know how to talk about that because at what point is that consensual?
Yeah, well, you bring up a great point. It's not a yes no kind of scenario. It's more of a spectrum, right?
Mm,
So the idea is that the younger the child is, the more responsibility that the parent or caregiver has for their well-being.
right.
And it's not just because the child is unable to do things for themselves. It's also because the child does not have an understanding, like literally is not able to understand all that goes into taking a medication or pursuing a treatment, right? Now, as a child becomes older, mostly into adolescence, there's a little bit more of an argument to be made for the fact that it's actually more important to try to explain what's going on to the teenager so that they've got an understanding of what's happening. And in scenarios, I've had situations where I go in, the parents want a medication for their child, the child says, nope, not taking it.
Right.
Well, guess what happens? I'm not prescribing a medication.
Yeah. That's
The
that's
reason
fair.
for it is because I'm not ever going to suggest to a parent, you need to hold down your kid and you need to shove the pill in their mouth and you need to do that every night until I say it's done. It's just not going to happen, right?
Right.
And the last thing I want is for parents to feel like they've got to crush up pills or hide it in food or
Right.
I'm not really for that at all. I think maybe for young kids, you can make an argument. Like you've probably seen those YouTube videos of somebody giving cough syrup to their kid, and they insert a straw into a Pepsi, but instead they're drinking like out of a little cup with the cough syrup.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you just kind of need to get creative that way with young kids. Adult kids, I'm sorry, not adult kids, but the older the child gets, the more important I think it becomes for that trust to not get violated,
Right.
especially with teenagers. The fact is, most relationships that teenagers have with their parents are actually pretty positive. That's what the research shows. The only relationships we ever hear about are the ones where things are on fire.
That is
And
right.
so that's where we get kind of the stereotypical, like, oh, teenagers are so tough and I don't know what to do with them. Most of the time, it's not actually the case. Where things start going off the rails is when it becomes a a power struggle where I'm the parent, I say this, or I'm going to lie to you because it's good for you. And once you start burning those bridges with your teenager, it's easier to burn down a bridge than it is to build one.
Fair enough.
And so, trust in between the parent and the child, it's always positive, but it's not always there. And so ultimately, the parent is still the one responsible for that child's well-being until they're at that legal age where they can just say, hey, listen, I'm out of here. I'm gone. You can't call the shots for me anymore. So that's generally how I've approached that question of, well, how much weight do I give to the parent? The answer is most of the time it's the parents calling the shots. Now, that doesn't mean that the child's input is also not important. It's really pretty important, especially
Right.
the older that they get.
Very interesting.
Well, these are great points, and thank you for discussing too about the line where we have to either do our day to day, do the natural things, which is to go out to interact with people, to do our day to day in the sense of avoiding depression and all these mental health issues. But then there's comes a point where we can't. There's a lot of distress that we have to go to see someone like you, right? We really appreciate this conversation, Josh. And just to finalize, my last question would be, what would you like to see in the world of psychiatry and psychology in the next couple of years to change and evolve in a positive way?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I would have to say probably my first answer would be a greater focus on preventive interventions. As the old saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we've got pounds and pounds of cure going on. we could stand to do with a few more ounces of prevention. Um, what does that look like? A huge chunk of it is parents have to be well. And the literature is pretty clear that parents who are not well, so for instance, a mom or a dad or a foster parent who's battling depression or anxiety or take your pick of any sort of mental illness, it does have an impact on kids. And I don't say that as a way of guilting people or saying that they're terrible parents. That's not it at all. Life happens. Life is tough. But that does not excuse us from the obligation to try to make ourselves better. And kids see that. Kids see all sorts of things. And what kids see acted out, they're far more likely to do than they are to have someone say, do as I say, not as I do. That's a terrible motto. Kids, they are so observant. And it's actually very clear for young kids that we actually act out what we learn more often than actually talk about it. And, well, what does that look like? Kids are more likely to have troubles in relationships if they see mom and dad fighting, or if they're exposed to domestic violence, for instance. Domestic violence all of a sudden becomes a tool that you can use to resolve conflict, and it doesn't work out. And so what you do as parents, what we do as adults, it matters. I guess that brings me to the second point, is that, and this is a little indirect way of kind of getting to the same problem, is that parents have slowly been diminished as an authority figure in child's lives, in children's lives. And what I mean by that is there's been a really big push towards deferring parental authority and decision making to others. Well, what does the doctor say? We'll just do what the doctor says. What does the teacher say? We'll do what the teacher says. What does the counselor at school say? We'll do what the counselor says. And it's not taught necessarily to the child, but the child picks up, mom and dad don't know what they're doing, and I can't trust them. And that's a really scary thing for a child to pick up from their environment. And it used to be, well, a lot of people who, and I've heard this argument where people say there's no downside to doing therapy. We'll just put the kid in counseling, nothing bad ever happens. That's not actually the case, because every time that you get a professional involved like that, you're deferring a chunk of that parent's autonomy and authority over the child to somebody else. And that's not to say it's not necessary. That's not to say that it's bad. Most of the time it's great. It can really be helpful. But when it becomes the answer for everything, or you use it at an inappropriate time, it can have an impact on that child's ability to rely on those caregivers. And those caregivers, historically, super important. They're the bedrock of a child's life. And so part of, I think, one really big kind of groundwater intervention that could happen, or a change that could happen. This is more of a cultural change. This is more like, wishing for world peace kind of thing, is that parents and caregivers again get back into the active driver's seat of their child's lives. And part of that is maybe we just don't do as much. Maybe we don't go to all the sports activities, don't get signed up for all the extracurriculars. We have dinners together as a family. We go and do things together as a family. If I've got a child, I spend one-on-one time with that child where it's just me and them. And it's not, it's not like a quick fix sort of thing. This is a thing where it's a long-term strategy for remaining an important influence in that child's life. And so that's something that I've seen in, again, my own clinical work, and again in the research, is we can't afford to let go of the steering wheel in our child's lives. We might not have all the answers. We might not be the experts. That does not relieve us of our obligation, our responsibility to be that driving force in our child's lives. So that's one big thing that I think would be a really big positive for children's mental health because, again, I'm not sure how it is in Canada. Canada and the U.S. tend to reflect each other in a lot of ways. Here in the United States, we're in a crisis of children's mental health.
Yeah.
I get emails every day, people reaching out and saying, we need a child psychiatrist. Will you come work for us? I'm not even soliciting these. Like, they're coming into my email inbox every day.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's a really big problem. And there's not enough meds in the world that I can sling
Yeah.
to resolve it. This is more than just putting out a fire. This does require some more fundamental changes. And I think part of that, too, is providing those environments that are welcoming, inviting, that provide a calm environment while also allowing for the ability to grow, which in many ways, in my mind, is synonymous with risk. It's being able to handle those dualities together.
Joshua, it was a pleasure having you inside the studio. We are grateful for the work that you're doing and for all the information that you provided us and the listeners. Thank you for your time, and we hope to talk with you again on this podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, both of you. As you can probably tell, I get really excited and passionate about what I do and trying to help people live better, more fulfilled lives. Again, I want to say thanks for opening up this kind of intersection between design and mental health, because quite frankly, I had not thought of it before. And it turns out it does play a pretty big influence in our well-being, in our lives, in our homes, at our schools, in hospitals. And so this is definitely something where I'm not going to be looking at hospitals and units the same way after our conversation. So I thank you both for allowing me on and being a part of this.